In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind lace curtains, a scream pierces the night, and Major Grayson lies dead beneath the ancient elm tree, a knife in his heart. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of grudges. Jealous nephew Roger, embittered spinster Miss Cole, a scorned actress, and a humiliated solicitor. A missing knife, a scratched door frame, and a silver cufflink led her closer to the truth. In a village where everyone knows too much, only one question remains. Who struck in the shadow of the elm? Dive into a classic mystery where every whisper hides a clue. Chapter 1. The Village of St. Mary Mead. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, gilding the thatched roofs and casting a warm glow across the village green. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her drawing room, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of habit. The click of the needles was a counterpoint to the distant trill of a blackbird, perched in the ancient elm tree that dominated the green, its gnarled branches, heavy with summer leaves, stretched like an old friend's arms over the heart of the village. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, lingered on the tree, noting how its shadow crept longer as evening approached. St. Mary Mead was a place of predictable rhythms, where the postman's bicycle and the vicar's sermons marked time as surely as the church clock. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet hamlet, Miss Marple sensed a faint discord. She had lived long enough to know that villages, like people, had their secrets, grudges nursed in silence, envies whispered behind closed doors. Her gaze flicked to the curtains of Mrs. Price's post office, twitching as if sharing her unease. The source of the village's disquiet was no mystery. Major Harold Grayson, a retired officer with a bristling moustache and a taste for garish waistcoats, had arrived 3 months prior, taking up residence at Elm House. His booming voice and brusque demeanour had ruffled feathers from the Women's Institute to the pub. He had quarrelled with Mr. Dunstan, the solicitor, over a boundary fence, snapped at Miss Lavinia Cole for her cat's trespassing, and, most scandalously, cut his nephew Roger from his will, a fact gleefully circulated by the village grapevine. Miss Marple, who missed little, had overheard Mrs. Barrow, the Major's housekeeper, lament his temper at the butcher's only yesterday. She adjusted her spectacles and reached for her tea, the delicate china cup warm in her hands. The scent of Darjeeling mingled with the roses outside, their petals nodding in the soft breeze. Her parlour was a haven of chintz and polished oak, its order a reflection of her mind, tidy, yet ever alert to the smallest irregularity. She was just considering the curious incident of Miss Cole's cat, which had vanished after the Major's threats, when a scream tore through the evening calm. It was a raw, jagged sound, sharp with terror, and it came from the direction of the elm tree. Miss Marple's cup paused mid-air, her heart giving a single, measured thud. She set the cup down with care, her movements unhurried but deliberate. Rising, she smoothed her skirt and reached for her shawl. She knew that scream. It was not the cry of a child at play or a lover's quarrel. It was the sound of death. Stepping onto the green, she saw a knot of villagers already gathering, their faces pale in the fading light. The elm tree loomed ahead, its roots twisting into the earth like veins. At its base lay Major Grayson, his eyes staring blankly at the sky, a dark stain spreading across his waistcoat. A kitchen knife, its handle plain and unadorned, jutted from his chest. The grass around him was churned, as if by a struggle, but no other marks caught Miss Marple's eye. No footprints, no telltale signs of flight. Constable Hurst, barely 20, and flushed with the weight of responsibility, was shooing back the crowd. "Stand back now, stand back!" he called, his voice cracking. Mrs. Price clutched her shawl, muttering prayers, while Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, gawked with the morbid curiosity of youth. Miss Cole stood apart, her thin lips pressed tight, her eyes fixed not on the body, but on the tree itself. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, cataloguing details, the angle of the knife, the Major's clenched fist, the odd stillness of the scene. She thought of a case long ago, in another village, where a man had fallen dead under similar circumstances. A quarrel, a blade, a secret. People, she reflected, were much the same everywhere. And in St. Mary Mead, someone had wanted Major Grayson dead. As the church clock struck 7, signalling the arrival of Inspector Craddock's car from Much Benham, Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows. She would return to her knitting soon enough, but first she would listen. The village would talk, and in its words, she would find the threads of truth. Chapter 2. The Body in the Shadow. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its pale light filtering through the twisted branches of the ancient elm tree, casting a lattice of shadows across the village green. The air was thick with the scent of dew-damp grass and the faint, metallic tang of blood. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, her eyes sharp and unyielding despite the hour. The scream that had pierced the evening calm had drawn the villagers like moths to a flame, and now they stood, a hushed semicircle, their faces etched with shock and curiosity. At the base of the elm tree lay Major Harold Grayson, his body unnaturally still, his once vibrant waistcoat now marred by a spreading crimson stain. The kitchen knife, its blade buried deep in his chest, gleamed dully in the moonlight, a stark and brutal punctuation to the scene. His right hand was clenched, as if grasping at life in his final moments, while his left lay open, fingers splayed against the earth. His walking stick, a sturdy affair with a brass handle, lay overturned a few feet away, its tip pointing toward the stone path that wound through the green. Constable Hurst, his youthful face pale beneath his helmet, was doing his best to maintain order. "Back now, all of you," he called, his voice wavering with the strain of authority. "This is a crime scene, and you'll not be trampling it." His efforts were met with murmurs and reluctant steps backward, though the villagers' eyes remained fixed on the body. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, clutched her shawl, her lips moving in silent prayer. Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, hovered at the edge of the crowd, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Miss Lavinia Cole, the spinster who lived in the cottage adjoining Elm House, stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly before her, her gaze darting from the body to the tree's gnarled roots. Miss Marple's keen eyes took in every detail, the churned grass around the Major's body, suggesting a brief struggle, the absence of footprints leading away from the scene, an oddity given the soft earth, and the peculiar position of the knife, driven straight and true, as if by a hand both steady and resolute. She noted, too, the Major's face, his mouth twisted in a grimace, his eyes open and staring, as if death had caught him by surprise. She had seen death before, in her long years in St. Mary Mead and beyond, and she knew its many faces. This was no accident, no sudden collapse of the heart. This was murder, deliberate and cold. The crunch of tyres on gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a lean man in his 40s, with a face that spoke of competence tempered by weariness. He stepped from his car, his overcoat flapping in the evening breeze, and surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "Constable," he said briskly, "clear the area. I want statements from everyone present." His gaze fell on Miss Marple, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. They had crossed paths before, in cases where her quiet observations had unravelled knots he hadn't even seen. He gave her a slight nod, as if to acknowledge her presence before turning to the body. Miss Marple stepped closer, her movements unobtrusive, her presence almost invisible among the villagers' agitation. She listened as Inspector Craddock questioned Constable Hurst, who stammered through his account of the scream and his discovery of the body. "Found him just as he is, sir," Hurst said, wiping his brow. "No one's touched a thing. I made sure of that." Craddock knelt beside the Major, his gloved hands careful not to disturb the scene. "Time of death can't be long," he muttered, glancing at his watch. "It's barely 7:30 now." Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of what she saw and heard. The Major had been alive at 6 when Mrs. Barrow, his housekeeper, had served him tea at Elm House. She had mentioned as much to Mrs. Price that afternoon. The scream had come just before 7, a narrow window for so final an act. She noted the crowd again, their faces illuminated by the lanterns Constable Hurst had set up. Mrs. Price's prayers had given way to whispered speculation with Mrs. Clements, the vicar's wife, who looked faintly ill. Tommy Pierce was edging closer, craning his neck to see the knife. Miss Cole, however, had not moved, her eyes fixed on the elm tree as if it held some private significance. "Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said, approaching her, his tone polite but guarded. "I suppose you've already formed an opinion?" His voice carried a hint of amusement, but she knew he valued her insight, even if he would never admit it outright. "Not an opinion, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "Merely observations. The grass, for instance. It's disturbed around the body, but there are no footprints leading away. And the knife, it's a common kitchen blade, but its position suggests a certain precision." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Precision, you say? You think this was planned?" "I think," she said carefully, "that someone knew exactly what they were doing. But as to who or why, well, that's for you to discover, isn't it?" She offered a small smile, her eyes twinkling with the knowledge that she would be watching, listening, and piecing together the truth in her own quiet way. The inspector turned back to the scene, calling for his sergeant to photograph the body before it was moved. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the green. The elm tree's roots, thick and twisted, formed a natural hollow where the Major lay, as if the tree itself had cradled his fall. She noticed a small tear in his waistcoat, not from the knife but higher, near the shoulder, a snag perhaps from a branch or a struggle. She filed it away, along with the odd absence of mud on the Major's polished shoes. The stone path, she thought, might explain that, but it raised questions of its own. As the crowd began to disperse, urged by Constable Hurst's insistent gestures, Miss Marple overheard snippets of conversation. "Never liked him," muttered Mr. Hayworth, the grocer, to his wife. "Always barking orders like he was still in the army." Mrs. Clements, her voice trembling, said to Mrs. Price, "It's dreadful, simply dreadful. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Cole, however, said nothing, her silence as telling as any words. Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her steps slow but purposeful. The village was awake now, its calm shattered, and she knew the days ahead would be filled with whispers and suspicions. She thought of the Major's quarrels, his nephew Roger cut from the will, Mr. Dunstan humiliated over the land dispute, Miss Cole nursing her grudge over her missing cat. Each was a thread in the tapestry of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere among them lay the truth. At home, she lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched on the table. Her mind turned to a case from years ago, in a village not unlike this one, where a man had been found dead in a garden, a knife in his chest. The killer had been a quiet soul, overlooked by all, driven by a motive no one had suspected. People, she reflected, were rarely what they seemed. The Major had been a man of wealth and temper, a man who made enemies as easily as others made friends. But which of those enemies had stood beneath the elm tree, knife in hand? She rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the green. The elm tree stood silent, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Somewhere in its shadow, she thought, lay the answer. Tomorrow, she would call on Elm House, under the guise of offering condolences. Mrs. Barrow, with her nervous tic and her habit of speaking too freely, might let slip something useful. And there was Miss Cole to consider. Her silence tonight had been more eloquent than words. As she drew the curtains, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the knife, a kitchen blade, plain and unremarkable, yet chosen with care. It spoke of opportunity, of access to Elm House perhaps, and the absence of footprints. Could the killer have come by the stone path, as the Major's clean shoes suggested? Or was there another explanation, something she had yet to see? She returned to her chair, her mind as sharp as the needle she now picked up. The village would talk, and she would listen. The truth, she knew, was there, hidden in the ordinary details of St. Mary Mead's life, the glance of a neighbour, the pause in a conversation, the shadow cast by an ancient elm. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her unerring instinct, would find it. Chapter 3. The Secrets of Elm House. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns across the cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her customary tweed skirt and a neatly pressed blouse, stepped out of her cottage, a basket of early roses in hand. The village was subdued, the usual chatter of the milkman, and the grocer's boy muted by the weight of the previous night's tragedy. The elm tree stood as it always had, its branches heavy with leaves, but to Miss Marple, it now seemed to loom with a quiet menace, as if guarding the secrets of the murder beneath its boughs. Her destination was Elm House, the Major's residence, a sturdy Georgian structure at the edge of the village green. Its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys gave it an air of permanence, but the drawn curtains and the stillness within suggested a house in mourning or fear. Miss Marple's ostensible purpose was to offer condolences, a neighbourly gesture that would raise no eyebrows. In truth, she sought the small, telling details that only a visit to the scene of a man's life could reveal. She had learned, over years of observing human nature, that houses, like people, held their stories in the creak of a floorboard or the dust on a shelf. Mrs. Barrow, the Major's housekeeper, answered the door, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She was a wiry woman in her 50s, with a nervous habit of twisting her apron in her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "It's kind of you to call. Such a dreadful thing, isn't it? The Major, gone like that." She trailed off, ushering Miss Marple into the dim hall. The interior of Elm House was as Miss Marple had expected. Heavy oak furniture, polished to a gleam, and walls lined with hunting prints and military memorabilia. The air carried the faint scent of pipe tobacco and beeswax, undercut by something sharper, fear perhaps, or the lingering echo of violence. Mrs. Barrow led her to the drawing room, where a fire burned low despite the warmth of the day. "I haven't known what to do with myself," the housekeeper confessed, sinking into a chair. "The police were here till late, asking questions, poking about. It's all so upsetting." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, setting her basket on a side table. "A terrible shock," she agreed, her tone gentle but her eyes alert. "I suppose the Major's passing has left many matters unresolved. He was a man of strong opinions, wasn't he?" Mrs. Barrow's hands twisted tighter in her apron. "Oh, he was that, miss. Never one to hold his tongue. Why, only last week he was shouting at young Roger, his nephew, you know, about money. Said he'd not leave him a penny. Not after Roger's gallivanting, as he called it." She lowered her voice, glancing toward the door. "Roger was here the day before it happened. They had words, fierce ones. I heard them from the kitchen." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her mind catalogued the information. Roger Grayson, the charming but wayward nephew, had been a frequent topic at the village shop. His fondness for fast cars and faster women had not endeared him to his uncle. "That must have been distressing," she said. "Did the Major often have visitors who upset him?" Mrs. Barrow hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. "Well, there was Mr. Dunstan, the solicitor. Came about some land business, a fence or some such. The Major was furious, said Mr. Dunstan was trying to cheat him, called him a pettifogging crook right to his face. And then there was Miss Cole, from next door. She was here a fortnight ago, all in a state about a cat. Said the Major poisoned it, though I never saw any proof. He laughed at her, told her to keep her mangy beast off his property." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The missing cat again. A small matter perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead, small matters could grow into motives. "How very unpleasant," she murmured. "And you, Mrs. Barrow, you must have borne the brunt of his temper." The housekeeper flushed, her fingers stilling for a moment. "He was sharp, miss, but I managed. Kept the house in order, cooked his meals. He liked things just so. Tea at 4, dinner at 7 sharp. Never a kind word, mind, but I'm used to that." She paused, then added, "He was in a rare mood yesterday, though. Kept pacing, muttering about settling scores. I thought it was just his way, but now—" Her voice broke, and she dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft. "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday, Mrs. Barrow? Anything out of place?" She was thinking of the knife, its plain handle so unlike the ornate decor of Elm House, yet clearly from a kitchen. Access, she knew, was as important as motive. Mrs. Barrow frowned, her brow creasing. "Well, now you mention it, there was something. One of the kitchen knives was missing when I set out the supper things. I thought I'd misplaced it, but with all this—" She gestured vaguely, her unease palpable. "And there was a scratch on the back door frame, fresh-like, as if someone had nicked it with something sharp. I noticed it when I took out the rubbish yesterday morning." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. A missing knife, a scratched door frame. These were threads she could weave into the pattern forming in her mind. "Most curious," she said lightly. "Perhaps you'll mention it to Inspector Craddock. He'll want to know every detail." As Mrs. Barrow nodded, Miss Marple rose, her eyes sweeping the room. A photograph on the mantel caught her attention. The Major in uniform, stern and upright, standing beside a younger man. Roger, perhaps, in better days. Nearby was a pipe rack, one slot empty, and a stack of letters, their edges uneven as if hastily opened. She made a mental note to inquire about the Major's correspondence. Letters, she knew, could reveal more than words spoken aloud. "Thank you, Mrs. Barrow," she said, retrieving her basket. "You've been most kind. I shan't take up more of your time." She paused at the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame. There it was, the scratch, a faint gouge in the dark wood, no deeper than a fingernail, but sharp-edged, as if made by metal. A knife, perhaps, carried in haste. She filed it away, her mind already turning to the stone path outside, which led to the elm tree. As she stepped into the sunlight, Miss Marple glanced toward Miss Cole's cottage, its curtains firmly drawn. The spinster's accusation about her cat intrigued her, not because she believed the Major had poisoned it, but because such a belief could fester into something darker. She thought of a case years ago, in a seaside town, where a woman's obsession with a lost pet had led to a shocking act of vengeance. People, she reflected, could be driven to extremes by the smallest slights. The village, Green, was quiet now, the crowd from the previous night gone, though a few curious glances followed her from behind windows. She paused by the elm tree, its roots sprawling like the fingers of an ancient hand. The spot where the Major had fallen was marked by trampled grass, now cordoned off with tape by Constable Hurst. She crouched slightly, her eyes scanning the ground. The Major's walking stick had been found a few feet away, its brass handle gleaming in the grass. Had it been knocked from his hand in a struggle, or placed there deliberately? And the absence of footprints, did it point to the stone path, or something else entirely? As she straightened, she noticed Tommy Pierce loitering near the post office, his bicycle propped against a wall. He was watching her, his young face alight with curiosity. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, his tone cheeky but respectful. "You looking for clues, then?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Merely taking a walk, Tommy. But you're a sharp lad. Did you see anything last night? Before the commotion?" Tommy scuffed his shoe against the pavement, his bravado fading. "Not much, miss. I was delivering bread to Mrs. Clements when I heard the scream. But earlier, I saw Roger Grayson near the green, talking to his uncle. Looked like they was arguing, but I couldn't hear what about." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "And nothing else? No strangers, no odd noises?" He hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, there was a lady, a week or so back, came to Elm House late, after dark. I saw her from my window. She looked fancy, like. Not from around here?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though she kept her tone light. "Fancy, you say? How interesting. Well, thank you, Tommy. Mind you don't repeat that to everyone." She slipped him a shilling, knowing it would buy his silence for a day or two. As she made her way home, her mind sifted through the morning's discoveries: the missing knife, the scratched door frame, Roger's argument, Miss Cole's grudge, and now a mysterious woman. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thought of the Major's temper, his habit of making enemies, and the knife, so ordinary, yet so deadly. Someone in St. Mary Mead had taken it from Elm House, carried it to the elm tree, and struck. But who? And why now? At her cottage, she set her basket down and reached for her knitting, the familiar rhythm calming her thoughts. She would attend the vicarage tea that afternoon, where the villagers' tongues would wag freely. There, among the clink of teacups and the murmur of gossip, she might find another thread to pull. For now, she sat by her window, the elm tree visible across the green, its shadow stretching long and dark, as if whispering of the secrets it held. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Tea Party. The vicarage garden was a picture of summer serenity, with roses climbing the trellis and bees humming lazily among the lavender. A long table, draped in crisp white linen, bore an array of scones, cucumber sandwiches, and a gleaming silver teapot, its steam curling into the warm June air. The Reverend Clement, a gentleman with a perpetually distracted air, stood at the garden gate, greeting his guests with a vague smile. His wife, Mrs. Clements, bustled about, ensuring every teacup was filled and every plate replenished. To the casual observer, it was a scene of quintessential St. Mary Mead charm, but Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a flowering crabapple tree, sensed the undercurrent of tension that rippled through the gathering. The murder of Major Grayson beneath the elm tree had cast a pall over the village, and the vicarage tea, an annual tradition, had become a crucible for its anxieties. Villagers mingled in small knots, their voices low, their glances darting toward the green where the elm tree stood, its branches now a silent witness to the crime. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her chair, strategically placed, offered a clear view of the guests, and her ears, attuned to the nuances of village gossip, missed nothing. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, held court near the tea urn, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as she leaned toward Mrs. Hayworth, the grocer's wife. "It's a scandal, that's what it is," Mrs. Price was saying, her voice carrying just enough to reach Miss Marple's ears. "I heard from Mrs. Barrow herself that the Major was expecting a visitor that night. A woman, mark you, and not one of us." Her tone was laced with disapproval, and Mrs. Hayworth nodded, her eyes wide with intrigue. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting needles. A woman, seen late at Elm House, as Tommy Pierce had mentioned. The detail was tantalizing, though she knew village gossip often embroidered truth with fancy. She filed it away, her mind turning to a case from years past, in a market town not far from here, where a rumoured affair had masked a far darker motive. People, she reflected, loved to weave stories of romance, but murder was rarely so poetic. Nearby, Miss Lavinia Cole sat alone, her tea untouched, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her severe black dress and pinched expression made her look like a mourner at a funeral, though Miss Marple suspected her grief was less for the Major than for her lost cat. She recalled Mrs. Barrow's account of Miss Cole's confrontation with the Major, her accusation of poisoning met with his scorn. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the spinster's trembling fingers, wondering if resentment could have driven her to more than words. Young Tommy Pierce, invited as a courtesy to his mother, loitered near the scone tray, his pockets bulging with pilfered treats. He caught Miss Marple's eye and grinned, unabashed, before sidling closer. "You still sleuthing, Miss Marple?" he whispered, his tone half mocking but curious. "I told you about that lady, didn't I? Bet she's the one what done it." Miss Marple smiled, her expression indulgent. "You're a sharp boy, Tommy, but let's not jump to conclusions. Did you see anything else that night? Near the elm tree, perhaps?" Tommy's grin faded, and he glanced toward the green, his bravado faltering. "Well, I didn't want to say, not with the constable about, but I saw a shadow, miss, just before the scream, moving quick-like near the tree. Couldn't make out who, though. Too dark." He shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "A shadow," Miss Marple repeated softly, her mind turning to the stone path that skirted the green. A shadow could mean anything. A person, a trick of the light, or even a memory distorted by fear. She thanked Tommy with a nod, her thoughts already weaving this new thread into the pattern. Shadows, she knew, often hid more than they revealed. Mrs. Clements approached, her face flushed from her hostess duties. "Miss Marple, you're awfully quiet today," she said, her tone warm but strained. "This dreadful business with the Major, it's upset us all. I can't think who'd do such a thing in St. Mary Mead." "It is distressing," Miss Marple agreed, her voice gentle. "But people, even in a village like ours, can harbour strong feelings. The Major, I understand, was not always congenial." Mrs. Clements hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He was a difficult man, I'll grant you. My husband tried to reason with him about the church fund. He wanted to redirect it to some military memorial, but the Major wouldn't hear of it, called the vicar a meddling fool. I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but—" She trailed off, her eyes darting toward Miss Cole, who sat rigid, staring at the tea table. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the spinster's isolation. "Miss Cole seems particularly affected," she remarked, her tone inviting confidence. Mrs. Clements leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "She's taken it hard, hasn't she? That cat of hers, she doted on it like a child. When it vanished, she was beside herself. She told me she saw the Major scattering something in his garden. Rat poison, she thought. She's convinced he's to blame." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind alert. Poison, even if unproven, was a serious charge, and Miss Cole's bitterness was palpable. She recalled a similar incident in her youth, where a woman's grief for a lost pet had twisted into a vendetta. Could such a passion drive one to murder? The knife suggested otherwise, a crime of impulse perhaps, rather than calculation. But Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss any possibility. As the tea party continued, she observed the other guests. Mr. Hayworth, the grocer, was deep in conversation with Mr. Dunstan, the solicitor, whose usually polished demeanour seemed strained. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Barrow's Mention of the Major's quarrel with Dunstan over a land dispute. The solicitor's hands, she noted, were clasped tightly, his knuckles white. Was it guilt, or merely the discomfort of being near a tragedy? Roger Grayson, the Major's nephew, was conspicuously absent, though Miss Marple had heard he was staying at the Blue Boar Inn. His absence spoke volumes. Grief, perhaps, or the caution of a man under suspicion. She made a mental note to visit the inn, where a casual inquiry might yield more than Inspector Craddock's formal questions. The afternoon wore on, the sun dipping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from face to face. The village was a tapestry of small resentments and hidden desires, and the Major's death had torn a hole in its fabric. She thought of the knife, its plain handle so at odds with the Major's ostentatious tastes. Had it been taken from Elm House in a moment of opportunity, or carried there with intent? And the shadow Tommy spoke of, could it be the mysterious woman, or someone closer to home? As the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Clements, promising to send a recipe for her rosehip jam, but her mind was elsewhere. The vicarage tea had given her much to ponder. Mrs. Price's gossip about a strange woman, Tommy's shadow, Miss Cole's silent fury, and Dunstan's unease. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the shape of the whole remained elusive. She stepped onto the village green, the elm tree looming ahead. Its roots, gnarled and ancient, seemed to pulse with the memory of the crime. She paused, her eyes tracing the stone path that led from Elm House to the tree. The absence of footprints, she thought, was as telling as their presence might have been. Someone had known that path, had used it to avoid detection. But who? As she walked home, the village settling into the quiet of late afternoon, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the human heart. In St. Mary Mead, as in every village, love and hate, greed and grief were woven together in ways that only time and careful observation could unravel. She would listen, she would watch, and she would find the truth hidden in the ordinary moments of tea parties and village greens. Chapter 5. The Nephew's Alibi. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward the Blue Boar Inn. Her steps were measured, her umbrella tucked under her arm, though the sky promised no rain. The inn, a low-beamed building with a sagging roof, stood at the far end of the village, its sign creaking gently in the breeze. It was a place of transient comings and goings, where travellers and locals alike shared pints and gossip, and Miss Marple knew it would be the perfect setting to test the threads of suspicion that had begun to form in her mind. Roger Grayson, the Major's nephew, was the talk of the village, his falling out with his uncle, a topic that had grown legs since the murder. His absence from the vicarage tea had been noted, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, suspected that his charm and easy smile masked a story worth hearing. She had heard from Mrs. Price that Roger was staying at the Blue Boar, and under the pretext of misplacing a glove during a previous visit, she resolved to call there, her eyes and ears open to the smallest details. The inn's taproom was dim, its air heavy with the scent of ale and wood smoke. A few early patrons nursed their drinks, their voices low, and the barmaid, Lily, a young woman with a pert nose and a wary glance, was polishing glasses behind the counter. Miss Marple approached with a smile, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. "Good morning, Lily," she said, her voice warm. "I seem to have lost a glove here the other day. Might I have a look around?" Lily's expression softened, though her eyes remained guarded. "Of course, Miss Marple. Not sure I've seen it, but you're welcome to check the back room." She gestured toward a small parlour off the tap room where Roger Grayson sat alone, a newspaper spread before him but unread. his fingers drumming on the table. Miss Marple thanked her and moved toward the parlour, pausing to adjust her shawl and observe Roger. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, with dark hair swept back and a tailored suit that spoke of better days. His face, however, bore the strain of recent events. His eyes were shadowed, and his mouth twitched with a nervous energy that belied his reputation for nonchalance. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone gentle but direct, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm J. Marple, from the village." Roger looked up, his smile quick but strained. "Not at all, Miss Marple. I've heard of you. Quite the village institution, aren't you?" His charm was practiced, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he folded the newspaper. "I'm merely a neighbour," she replied, settling into a chair opposite him. "I was so sorry to hear about your uncle. A dreadful business." Roger's smile faltered. "Yes, dreadful. I still can't quite believe it. Stabbed right there on the green." He shook his head, his fingers resuming their restless drumming. "The police have been at me, you know. Inspector Craddock seems to think I had something to do with it." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, as if in surprise, though she had anticipated this. "Surely not," she said. "You were here at the inn, weren't you, when it happened?" Roger nodded quickly. Too quickly, she thought. "Exactly. I was here all evening, playing cards with some of the lads. Lily can vouch for me. She was serving drinks till late." His voice was confident, but his eyes darted toward the taproom, where Lily was still polishing glasses, her back to them. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. How reassuring. It must be a comfort to have such a clear alibi, though I suppose you and your uncle had your differences, as families sometimes do. Roger's jaw tightened, but he maintained his smile. "Oh, you've heard the gossip, have you?" "Yes, Uncle Harold and I had a row, about money mostly. He thought I was a wastrel, always gallivanting as he put it. Cut me out of his will last week, said I'd get nothing unless I shaped up. But I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I was here, like I said." She nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Of course, families can be complicated. I remember a case in my youth, a young man much like yourself, caught in a quarrel over an inheritance. It turned out to be a misunderstanding, but the village talked for weeks." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any flicker of unease. Roger leaned back, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, there's no misunderstanding here. I was fond of the old man in my way, but he was a tyrant. Ask anyone. Half the village had a grudge against him." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the knife, the missing blade from Elmhouse's kitchen. "Indeed," she said. "It's curious, though, about the knife. A kitchen knife, I hear, from your uncle's own house. Someone must have known their way around." Roger's fingers stilled, and for a moment his face was unreadable. "I wouldn't know about that," he said, his voice a shade too casual. "I haven't been to Elmhouse in days. Too busy here, you see." Miss Marple smiled, rising from her chair. "Of course. Well, I mustn't keep you. If you see my glove, a grey kidskin one, do let me know." She moved toward the tap room, pausing to speak with Lily, who was now wiping down the counter. "Lily, dear, Mr. Grayson tells me you were here the night of the Major's death. It must have been a busy evening." Lily's hands faltered, and she glanced toward the parlour, where Roger was once again pretending to read his paper. "Oh yes, miss," she said, her voice hesitant. "It was busy, all right. Mr. Grayson was here, playing cards, like he said. Till late, I think." Her words were careful, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on her cheeks, the way her eyes avoided contact. "How kind of you to remember," Miss Marple said, her tone encouraging. "It's such a help to the police, having reliable witnesses. You didn't happen to notice if Mr. Grayson stepped out at all, did you? For a breath of air, perhaps?" Lily's flush deepened, and she busied herself with a cloth. I don't recall, miss. It was a hectic night, with the regulars and all. I was run off my feet." Her voice was strained. and Miss Marple knew better than to press further. A bribe, perhaps, or a personal attachment. Either way, Lily's hesitation was a thread to follow. As she left the inn, Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. Roger's alibi was plausible, but Lily's unease suggested it was not airtight. She recalled Tommy Pierce's account of seeing Roger arguing with the Major near the elm tree earlier that day. Had he returned later under cover of darkness? The knife, taken from Elm House, pointed to someone with access, and Roger, as the Major's nephew, would have known the house well. Yet his shoes, she remembered from their meeting, were polished to a gleam, free of the mud that clung to the grass around the elm tree. The stone path, perhaps, or another explanation. She walked slowly back to the village green, pausing by the elm tree. The police tape was gone, but the spot where the Major had fallen was still marked by flattened grass. She crouched, her eyes scanning the ground for anything overlooked. A small twig, snapped cleanly, caught her attention, half buried in the soil. It was an odd detail, unremarkable to most, but to Miss Marple it suggested a hurried movement, perhaps a stumble. She pocketed it discreetly, her mind turning to the scratch on Elm House's door frame. A knife, carried carelessly, could have made such a mark, but by whom? As she straightened, she saw Miss Lavinia Cole emerging from her cottage, her face set in its usual severe lines. Miss Marple raised a hand in greeting, but Miss Cole's response was a curt nod, her eyes fixed on the elm tree. The spinster's bitterness toward the Major was no secret, and Miss Marple wondered if her solitude hid a deeper anger. She made a note to speak with her, perhaps under the guise of borrowing a gardening book. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The morning's discoveries, Roger's shaky alibi, Lily's hesitation, the snapped twig, were pieces of a puzzle that refused to cohere. She thought of a case from her past, where a young man's charm had masked a calculating heart. Roger was charming, certainly, but was he a killer? And what of the mysterious woman mentioned at the vicarage tea? Could she be the key, or merely a distraction? The village clock chimed noon, its sound carrying across the green. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the elm tree, its shadow stretching long and dark. The truth, she knew, lay in the interplay of human passions, greed, anger, fear. She would continue to listen, to watch, and to piece together the fragments until the pattern emerged, as it always did, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. The Shadow in the Night. The twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a soft violet hush, the kind of evening where the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for secrets to surface. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting abandoned on the table, her eyes fixed on the elm tree across the green. Its silhouette loomed against the fading sky, its branches swaying gently, as if whispering of the violence it had witnessed. The murder of Major Grayson was a wound in the village's heart, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to stitch it closed by finding the truth. Her morning at the Blue Boar Inn had left her with more questions than answers. Roger Grayson's alibi, propped up by Lily's hesitant corroboration, was flimsy at best, and Tommy Pierce's mention of a shadow near the elm tree lingered in her mind. Was it a figure in the dark, or merely the boy's imagination, stirred by the excitement of tragedy? Then there was the mysterious woman, whispered about at the vicarage tea, and glimpsed by Tommy weeks before. Miss Marple's thoughts kept circling back to her. A stranger in St. Mary Mead was rare, and her connection to the Major could be the key to unravelling the crime. Determined to follow this thread, Miss Marple had written to her old friend, Dolly Bantry, whose knowledge of theatrical circles might shed light on the woman's identity. Dolly's reply, delivered by the afternoon post, lay open on the table. In her characteristically breezy scrawl, Dolly confirmed the woman was likely Clara Wells, a former actress who had once dazzled London stages before retiring to Much Benham. She had been linked to Major Grayson years ago, during his time in the city, a brief, scandalous affair that ended when he threatened to expose her past indiscretions. "She's a charmer, Jane," Dolly wrote, "but with a temper to match. If Harold crossed her, I wouldn't put it past her to hold a grudge." Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind turning to Clara's possible role. A woman scorned could be a dangerous creature, as she had seen in a case long ago, where a jilted lover had struck with calculated precision. But the knife, so plain and domestic, suggested a crime closer to home. Could Clara have slipped into Elm House, taken the knife, and waited beneath the elm tree? Or was she a distraction, a shadow cast to obscure the real culprit? Resolving to meet Clara herself, Miss Marple decided to visit Much Benham the next day. But first, she felt compelled to return to the scene of the crime. The elm tree, with its gnarled roots and silent presence, seemed to beckon her. She donned her coat, her movements unhurried but purposeful, and stepped into the gathering dusk. The village was quiet, the green deserted, save for a lone blackbird flitting among the branches. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and fading roses, and Miss Marple's eyes were sharp as she approached the tree. The spot where Major Grayson had fallen was marked by a faint disturbance in the grass, now trampled by curious villagers and the police. Miss Marple crouched, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the ground. The moonlight revealed little, but as she ran her fingers along the roots, she felt something cold and metallic. Carefully, she extracted it. A cufflink, small and silver, engraved with a single letter, D. Her heart quickened, though her face remained composed. D could stand for Dunstan, the solicitor, whose quarrel with the Major over a land dispute was well known. Or was it another clue pointing elsewhere? She pocketed the cufflink, her mind racing. The absence of footprints had puzzled her from the start, suggesting the killer had used the stone path from Elm House to avoid leaving traces in the soft earth. But the cufflink, caught in the roots, implied a struggle or carelessness. She recalled the snapped twig she had found earlier, another sign of haste. The killer, she thought, had been confident, but not flawless. As she straightened, a rustle in the bushes made her pause. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, but saw only the flicker of leaves in the breeze. Tommy's shadow came to mind, and she wondered if someone was watching, aware of her probing. She made her way back to the path, her steps deliberate, her senses alert. The village, so peaceful on the surface, was alive with hidden currents, and Miss Marple knew she was stirring them. Back at her cottage, she lit a lamp and examined the cufflink under its glow. It was well crafted, the kind a man of means might wear, but not ostentatious. Mr. Dunstan, with his polished suits and precise manners, was a likely candidate, but she cautioned herself against hasty conclusions. She thought of a case in her youth, where a lost button had led to a killer, not because it was his, but because it had been planted to mislead. Could this cufflink be a similar ruse? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Price, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, I had to tell you," she said, stepping inside without invitation. "I was at the post office, sorting the late mail, and I heard from Mr. Hayworth that Clara Wells was seen in Much Benham today, asking about train times to London. Doesn't that seem suspicious, with the Major's murder and all?" Miss Marple's expression was one of polite interest, but her mind was alert. "Most interesting," she said. "Did Mr. Hayworth say anything else about her?" Mrs. Price nodded eagerly. "He said she looked agitated, kept glancing about as if someone might be following her, and she was carrying a small case, like she was planning to leave in a hurry." Miss Marple thanked her, ushering her out with promises of a recipe for lavender scones. Clara's behaviour suggested fear, or guilt. A trip to Much Benham was now imperative. She sat down, her mind sifting through the day's discoveries. The cufflink, Clara's possible flight, and the shadow that haunted Tommy's memory. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the whole remained elusive. She recalled the scratch on Elm House's doorframe, a mark that suggested a knife carried in haste. Could Clara have entered the house, perhaps during one of her late-night visits, and taken the blade? Or was the cufflink a stronger clue, pointing to Dunstan, or another with the initial D? She thought of the Major's enemies. Roger, with his motive of money. Miss Cole, with her festering grudge. Dunstan, humiliated by accusations of fraud. And now Clara, a woman with a past tied to the Majors. As the village clock struck 9, Miss Marple rose, her resolve firm. Tomorrow she would take the early bus to Much Benham and call on Clara Wells. A conversation, conducted with her usual gentle probing, might reveal whether the actress was a victim of circumstance or a player in a darker drama. For now, she returned to her window, the elm tree a dark shape against the night sky. The shadow in the night, she thought, was not just a figure, but a truth, waiting to be brought into the light. Chapter 7. The Final Piece. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the mist that hung low over the village green. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a sensible grey coat and her best hat, boarded the early bus to Much Benham, her mind as sharp as the crisp air. The elm tree, visible through the bus window, stood as a silent sentinel, its roots cradling the memory of Major Grayson's death. The cufflink marked D, now tucked safely in her handbag, weighed heavily on her thoughts, as did the news of Clara Wells's agitated behaviour in Much Benham. Miss Marple knew that the threads of this mystery, Roger's shaky alibi, Miss Cole's bitterness, the mysterious woman, and now the cufflink, were drawing together. But the pattern was not yet complete. Much Benham was a bustling market town, its streets alive with the clatter of carts and the chatter of shoppers. Clara Wells lived in a modest flat above a milliner's shop, its windows adorned with lace curtains that hinted at a faded elegance. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stairs, her knock soft but firm. The door opened to reveal Clara, a striking woman in her late 40s, her auburn hair swept into a loose bun, her eyes wary but bright with a performer's poise. She wore a silk dressing gown, as if caught unprepared, but her smile was practised. "Miss Wells?" Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "I'm Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. I've come about Major Grayson. Such a tragic business. I thought you might appreciate a visitor, given your acquaintance with him." Clara's smile faltered, but she gestured Miss Marple inside. The flat was small, cluttered with theatrical mementos, playbills, a tarnished silver mirror, a photograph of a younger Clara in costume. "You're kind to call," she said, her voice low and musical. "I heard about Harold's death. It's dreadful, but I hadn't seen him in weeks." She sat, her hands clasped tightly, betraying her composure. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her eyes taking in the room's details. The open suitcase in the corner, half-packed, and a train timetable on the table. "It must have been a shock," she said, her tone sympathetic. "I understand you visited him recently at Elm House. It can't have been easy, given your history." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her poise. "You've been listening to village gossip, I see." "Yes, I went to see him, about a month ago. I needed his discretion. Old matters, you understand, from our time in London. He was unkind, threatened to spread stories that could ruin me. But I left, and that was that." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened, crumpling the silk of her gown. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Of course. And the night of his death? You were here, I presume?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking to the suitcase. "Yes, alone. I don't go out much these days. Too many memories." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple sensed truth mingled with fear. Clara was no killer, she thought, but she knew something she was reluctant to share. You mentioned old matters, Miss Marple said, her tone light but probing. Did the Major ever speak of anyone else troubling him? A name, perhaps, that stood out? Clara's lips parted, then closed, as if weighing her words. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. He mentioned Dunstan. Edward Dunstan, the solicitor, said he'd caught him in some shady dealing over land. Harold was furious, called him a thieving weasel. I didn't think much of it then, but now. She trailed off, her eyes wide with realization. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The cufflink, marked D, flashed in her mind. Edward Dunstan, humiliated by the Major's accusations, had been at Elm House the day of the murder, according to Mrs. Barrow. Could he have taken the knife, waited for his moment, and struck beneath the elm tree? The stone path, she recalled, would explain the lack of footprints, and the scratch on the doorframe could have been made by a blade carried in haste. Thank you, Miss Wells, Miss Marple said, rising. You've been most helpful. I hope you'll stay in Much Benham a while longer. Inspector Craddock may have questions. Her tone was gentle, but her words carried a subtle warning. Clara nodded, her face pale, and Miss Marple left, her mind racing with the new piece of the puzzle. Back in St. Mary Mead, she walked to the village green, pausing by the elm tree to collect her thoughts. The cufflink, Clara's revelation, and the stone path formed a compelling picture, but Miss Marple cautioned herself against certainty. She recalled a case from her past, where a single clue, a monogrammed handkerchief, Josai system. I noticed that the response was cut off mid-sentence. Would you like me to continue and complete Chapter 7 of The Murder Beneath the Elm Tree from where it left off, maintaining the Agatha Christie-esque style, or would you prefer I address the cut-off and provide a summary or clarification instead?